Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to colleagues and visitors to the university, and good evening, one or two students, to this latest in the Schools of Art and Humanities inaugural lecture series. And it's a series I think has been a great joy this year. Sometimes the old traditions are the best, and especially when you get to my age, you think that more and more. And the tradition of the inaugural lecture, I think, is quite special. It is an opportunity for us to discover what our colleagues in different subjects are doing, and they're, of course, encouraged to talk in a way that other people can understand. And that is quite an exciting discipline, but it does open up windows to people from outside their discipline to begin to understand the nature of scholarship across the university. And I always find it very exciting, and indeed I always say one of the great joys of being a Vice-Chancellor is you do have time to dabble around and see what's going on across such an exciting range of disciplines. And almost every day has surprises in terms of the work that is going on. But tonight it is therefore my very pleasant duty to introduce Professor Nicola Cooper, who is Professor of French in the university. I've been given quite copious notes on Professor Cooper's background, and I think that the person who's prepared the notes realises from the way I've spoken in the past in introducing inaugural lectures that I'm always fascinated by people's background, where they've worked and what's inspired them. And there's so much here about what's inspired Professor Cooper that I feel that I know her much better than when she was interviewed for the post. I think she might have thought it was best to keep some of the things quiet when she was interviewed for the post. I'm not sure. But my notes start with Professor Cooper going across to France and doing a year's stint teaching English and phonetics at the University of Paris, Aix and Nanterre. Then she went on to study in comparative literature at the Sorbonne, quite taken with France, clearly. But the experience at the Sorbonne, I'm told, resulted in her shifting direction entirely on her return to Britain, highly influenced by her experiences. And the word radical appears a lot in this document, somehow radicalized during this informative period in Paris. And on her return to Britain, she wrote a master's thesis on French politics and European integration, which might happen someday. And then commenced a doctorate on French colonialism at the University of Warwick. For her PhD, Professor Cooper turned to aspects of the French Empire where little research had been done, eventually settling on a cultural history of French rule in Indochina. But in 1996, during just the second year of her doctorate, and this is just 1996, this is just over 10 years ago, in the second year of her doctorate, she took up her first appointment as a lecturer, in this case in European Studies at the University of Sussex. And if you do that, if you interrupt your PhD studies to take a lecturing post and move into a sort of teaching environment, it creates a busy life. And I'm told she hasn't yet recovered from that. So she must be a bit of a workaholic. Certainly, I've noted before during this series that one of my worries is that professors are getting younger and younger. And clearly we're now having professors who only started their PhDs just over 10 years ago. But her enduring theme in her research is a belief that how a nation colonizes other countries reveals a sense of its own identity, particularly in comparison with the culture being colonized. And this is expressed in so many different ways, she claims, from architecture to film, literature to propaganda, and even educational curricula and travel writing. And I suppose in Wales we can see some comparisons there. After stints at 3 universities, and here we go, renowned for their radicalism. I'm not quite sure whether Warwick's included in that list, but I think it must be Sussex.
In its early days.
Nikki had a traditionalist interlude at the University of Bristol. But being somewhat older, I don't take that view of Bristol. I remember the OTC in Bristol advising the Vice-Chancellor how they could move in with tear gas down the chimneys to clear a university sit-in in the Senate House. But those are days you're too young to remember. But she wasn't long in Bristol, and she was appointed to this chair in Swansea in 2006. And in taking up the position in French, she followed a department gender tradition, because back in 1921, Dr. Mary Williams was appointed Professor of French Language and Literature here at Swansea and became the first female professor to be appointed in the United Kingdom. Quite a remarkable achievement. Professor Cooper's arrival at Swansea coincided with the launch of the Journal of War and Culture Studies, of which she is editor. The journal has published issues on war and visual culture, the body at war, the figure of the soldier, and intellectuals in war, and is now in its 2nd volume. And the journal is planning a special issue on war and masculinities, the basis of which will emerge at an international conference collaboratively organised by Swansea Research Centres, MACAM and GenCAS, those 2 research centres here in Swansea, and the conference will take place at Grugannog in September. Professor Cooper is also an editor of the journal French Cultural Studies. So how she finds time for all her work, I just don't know. She's published widely, however, on the French Empire and colonialism, French thinkers and French thought, French history and politics, and French culture and society. Much of her work, however, takes a comparative or transnational approach. She's currently engaged in a major ESRC-funded project on comparative colonial practices across the 9 international concessions in the Chinese treaty port of Tianyang. As her research background and her inaugural lecture will, I'm sure, attest, she has specific interests in war and empire and the aftermaths of both. So therefore, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Nicola Cooper, who will present her inaugural lecture, Hold the Line, there it is, Wars, Colonialism, Cultural History, and the Dilemmas of Interdisciplinarity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice-Chancellor. I'm going to start with an apology for the rather wordy and somewhat obscure title for this lecture, but conceiving of the lecture did pose me a number of dilemmas. The main dilemma was which aspect amongst the several strands of my research to privilege in the lecture: colonial history, cultural history, French history, politics, society, memory studies, post-colonial studies, war and conflict studies. So, in the spirit of, firstly, not really being able adequately to resolve that dilemma for myself, but secondly, more importantly, in the spirit of contributing, perhaps in a small way, to facilitating the emergence of the types of research synergies and collaborations that we are hoping will result from the new merged School of Arts and Humanities, I have quite simply decided to provide a very brisk canter through a range of research areas and topics which have recently been occupying me, both current ones and some prospective ones too. But the starting point really has to be colonial ideologies and colonial iconographies, because much of my work has been interested in the ways in which imperial France viewed and represented its role abroad, and the representations and perceptions of the colonies which were produced and disseminated in a variety of cultural media emanating from mainland France. My source material, as the Vice-Chancellor said, has been quite eclectic, from the hard history of archival documents, urban policy, and architecture in the colonies, education policies, racial policies, and official propaganda, through to popular culture, film, fiction, songs, exhibitions, in an attempt, essentially, to provide a more cumulative and plural sense of France's own imperial identity and its different relationships with its various colonial territories. My interest has been the means through which these imperial and colonial identities were constructed and maintained, what discursive devices were implemented, and what motifs emphasized in the construction of these identities. Formulated retrospectively in the 19th century by then Prime Minister Jules Ferry, somewhat after the event, for France's acquisition of empire was haphazard, to say the least, France's colonial doctrine provoked considerable parliamentary debate and eventually caused Ferry's downfall. His legacy, however, was to have constructed, as I said, albeit retrospectively, a colonial doctrine for France which reposed upon a trinity of values: protection, benevolence, and altruism, which found expression through the term mission civilisatrice, civilizing mission. The French colonial doctrine contained a strong emphasis on the moral and cultural dimension, which stemmed from the French belief in the universal value of its civilization, which in turn found its roots in the nation's revolutionary legacy. This first slide embodies Ferry's vision, the spread of French influence and radiance across the globe, partially because this was important for a nation which was still bruised after the humiliation at the hands of the Prussians in 1870 and which was seeking to rehabilitate its own prestige and grandeur internationally, but justified through an idea of civilizing mission which emanates from the Enlightenment, the very literal Enlightenment of the slide here, spreading the light of French civilization over the dark, obscure and backward areas of the globe. A civilizing mission which came to be elevated to the status of a duty, an obligation, and even a French vocation. If the 19th century had been dominated by concerns to demonstrate economic and military prowess through the acquisition of a colonial empire, then the early 20th century was marked by a desire to legitimize that acquisition and to express national prestige through the beneficial contribution of French rule to colonized territories. This shift became all the more evident in a chastened post-World War I European climate, where France, as many of its imperial counterparts, distanced itself from the violent and acquisitive origins of empire to concentrate even more strongly on the humanitarian value of French colonization. Albert Sarraut, who was Governor-General of French Indochina and then later Minister for Colonies, retrospectively conceded that colonialism had originally been a primitive act of force, but asserted that this initially violent confrontation could be transformed into a collective triumph of solidarity and fraternity. So where 19th century colonial imagery had privileged visual assertions of masculinized versions of power, authority, conquest and domination through, in the far image here, through flag planting and other phallic demonstrations of imperial prowess, here astride Madagascar, the soldier is master of all that he has conquered. But different embodiments of the imperial nation began to emerge in the 20th century, which emphasized feminized versions of the imperial nation. The mother of the very peculiar collocation La Mère Patrie, which is here, that France calls itself the mother fatherland, literally. So the mother of this dual appellation came to the foreground in iconographies of the imperial nation. Although the French tricolour is still as present, rallying the dispersed natives to Greater France, here the great mother figure in the central image there articulates a reworked vision of imperial cohesion. For here, the rallying is not achieved through war or coercion, as in the previous image, but through the promise of shelter, abundance, and the bestowal of justice, protection, and nurture. This is an image which expresses the post-war desire to distance France from the bloody legacy of conquest and to present colonialism as an ethically based project. This revised version of the imperial project came to be enshrined in a set of policies known as mise en valeur, which has no easy translation, so I'm going to say development. But for France, this meant moral, intellectual, cultural, as well as economic and industrial development. The man of empire by the 20th century was no longer figured as a conquering hero. He had become an administrator, a technician, a scientist, as in the final image. Nonetheless, however rigorously the nation's policymakers, its colonial lobby and its colonial administrators may have thought that they had defined, codified and fixed the identity of the colonies and set the terms of the relationship between France and its various territories, the colony nevertheless invariably escaped those definitions and undermined the conceptual foundation which had been constructed for it. This occurred either through the resistance or the refusal to comply on the part of the colonized peoples, or more interestingly perhaps, through slippages, linguistic, cultural, ideological, etc., from within colonialism's own ranks. Counter-narratives emerged which disturbed the colonial order. Amidst a generalized dismay by the 20s and 30s, certainly, regarding the failures of French colonial administration and management, there emerged a recurring lament concerning the parlous behavior of the metropolitan French abroad, where the colonial, innately superior by birth, nationality and class, was supposed to command immediate respect from his colonial underlings through his very bearing and demeanour. Commentators instead found that the effects of an indiscriminate policy of recruitment to the colonial services had created an unworthy and undignified white underclass which threatened France's position abroad. Thus, parallel to the existence of strongly codified and constantly reiterated discourses concerning a coherent colonial doctrine, there coexisted discourses which strongly foregrounded numerous fears and anxieties concerning the integrity and stability of the colonial project and of imperial identity. Boundary anxieties emerged relating to the proximity between colonizer and colonized, concerns about the shortening of the distance between the two upon which colonialism is predicated, and allied fears concerning disease and moral turpitude. Class anxieties and gender anxieties combined in fears about miscegenation and the dilution of the French race. The shift towards a maternalized vision of imperial identity also found expression in a newly imagined disciplinary role for French women in the colonies. France hadn't ever really been very active or successful in promoting the migration of European French to its colonies, and Algeria was only really a true settlement colony. And these colonial anxieties provided an incentive to France's key colonial policymakers to encourage migration, but particularly female migration, to other areas of the empire. On the one hand, these women were to breed a race of future men of empire, and on the other, they were to prevent the dissipation of colonial virility in what were perceived to be unhealthy directions. So a more critical analysis of France's men of empire emerged. For while the unruly native had been the main concern during the period of conquest, from the turn of the century onwards, it was the unruly European who threatened to undermine the imperial project from within. In a guidebook to colonial life, one commentator remarked that the English say that the equatorial colonies are the countries of the 3 Ds: drink, divorce, and death. The French version of the 3 Ds might well be detritus, delinquency, and decadence. France had exported to its empire a white proletariat, the mainland's déchets, rubbish, detritus, or, as one commentator said, the young dunce whose family had failed to find him a position in the mainland. Or again, in the words of a Goncourt-winning novel, the colonies are a dung heap onto which the mainland spits out its excrement and rottenness. The slovenly morals, the indiscipline, licentiousness and rough vulgarities of this proletariat were conspiring to diminish the prestige of the ruling race. The unruly European, whose behaviour, appearance and morals deviated from the ideal, threatened the very boundaries and barriers which shored up the differences upon which colonial rule was premised. These people were wicked, debauched, immoral, idle, criminal, or just plain feeble. The empire had become a dumping ground, an outlet for whatever the metropole, the mainland, wanted to be rid of. As one politician noted, it's more a question of sweeping out the streets of Paris than populating the colonies. Indeed, many of France's criminals and marginals were dumped out in the colonies. For instance, the empire was host to the infamous Bataillon d'Afrique, or BATDAF as they were known, to which former French criminals were sent to complete their duty of military service in order to prevent the young male bourgeoisie from having to mix with these undesirables and reprobates. Each regiment also had a disciplinary unit which became the home of soldiers who had committed repeated serious offences. A notorious military prison which came to be known under the generic term biribi, you can see that here, biribi, a place where murder happened, routine torture, appalling conditions, a sort of latter-day Abu Ghraib, really, but aimed at your own. And biribi became a frequent feature of popular fiction, music hall, and silent film. For public fascination was more excited by these mauvais garçons, the bad boys, than by the empire's technicians and administrators. Far removed from his heroic predecessor, the man of empire became a composite type, a tattooed thug, a former thief or pimp, a reprobate, an intractable rebel. In popular culture, the imperial villain prevailed over the imperial hero. Popular perception was that the empire had been won, and furthermore, it was being maintained by this motley band of criminals, marginals, and foreigners. Which, of course, brings me to the French Foreign Legion, because I'm writing a book about that at the moment. And the fact that the conquest of French Algeria and the creation of the French Foreign Legion are contemporaneous does little to dispel the impression that Paris saw in the nascent empire much more than an outlet for the excesses that were crowding its streets. The Legion, at its inception in 1831, functioned more or less as a décharge or a dump, an outlet for undesirables or étrangers gênants, bothersome foreigners. The Foreign Legion, with its HQ in Sidi Bel Abbès in Algeria, was formed, in the words of then French War Minister Soult, with the only purpose of creating an outlet and giving a destination to foreigners who flood into France and could cause trouble. The Legion then was initially intended to remove from France, from mainland France, officers and soldiers who were felt to be awkward, excitable, or frankly dangerous subjects for the new monarchy. The Legion operated as a safety valve. Dangerous elements were removed from the heart of the nation and located outside its borders, tamed and put to the service of the nation. However, the Legion was always at the forefront of France's drives towards overseas expansion and colonial conquest. The Legion was involved in Tonkin, Dahomey, Madagascar, and continued from its base in Algeria to extend French influence across North Africa, as you see in this postcard here, honour to the French Foreign Legion. As bearers of the French tricolour during the period of colonial conquest, the Legion acted in the name of France's civilizing mission, French values and French principles. France thus handed over the export of the nation's values to a cohort of foreign undesirables who were frequently portrayed as drunken, ill-disciplined criminals. The Legion functioned as a sort of controlled and domesticated version of the so-called primitive hordes that France was seeking to civilize. Now, it might seem curious to hand over the export of the nation's values to this cohort of foreign undesirables. But there was very little consensus over the nation's colonial project until at least the turn of the century. So using the Legion abroad spared unnecessary French deaths in unpopular colonial escapades. Furthermore, ambivalence concerning the nation's colonial project, particularly concerning those anxieties about the dangers of proximity within the colonial relationship, made the Legion an ideal intermediary between perceived civilization and barbarity. Using the Legion in the nascent empire precluded contact and contamination between colonized and colonizer. And because colonial propaganda necessarily had to present native opponents as cruel and savage, the image of the legionnaire had to match and exceed this stereotype in terms of toughness and ferocity. Hence the reputation of the legionnaire as an outlaw. His own untamability allowed him to subdue the most intractable of opponents. And I've got a quote here from British English Picture Post from 1939, and you kind of have to do a posh British accent to get the sense of this, which I'm not going to attempt, I don't think. But it says, "The Sahara is not empty. The Senussi live in it, a fanatical brotherhood of Puritan soldiers. The Legion has tamed them." So that's the kind of impression of the Legion that people generally had. Legionnaires might thus be considered as the Republic's gatekeepers, not only keeping the colonial hordes at bay and policing those perceived boundaries between civilization and barbarity, but also, crucially, allowing the French nation to distance itself somewhat from the violence of colonial conquest carried out in its name. The Legion made disavowal possible. Thus, in the colonial context, the Legion occupies a liminal position. Stationed between the two poles of barbarity and civilization, the Legion, foreign itself, functioned as a sort of controlled and domesticated version of the savages France was seeking to civilize. Indeed, the Legion still functions in an anachronistically colonial way. It still has training bases in Djibouti, Guyana, and Mayotte, and has been heavily involved in what many might consider to be France's neo-colonial interference in places such as Rwanda and Ivory Coast. The colonial and post-colonial function of the Legion provides insights into one of the key ways in which it is useful to France. When France wishes to avoid inspiring negative public opinion, it has a tendency to send in the Legion. It's almost like a military hedging of bets. The Legion functions as a sidearm to be deployed in less appealing international manoeuvres, or where unpalatable levels of sacrifice are required. The expendability of the legionnaire at certain points in history is perhaps most clearly illustrated by the Legion's recruitment of former Wehrmacht and SS troops at the end of the Second World War for service in Indochina. It might be argued that the Legion has never shed this image of barely contained criminality and excess. This is in part due to the tradition of anonymat in the Legion. On enlistment, the legionnaire undergoes a complete refashioning of his identity. New values are inculcated, new bonds of loyalty forged, a new language adopted. The tradition of anonymat also means that the Legion has long had a reputation for harbouring criminals, vagabonds, and ne'er-do-wells. Yet, the Legion also enjoys an enviable reputation as an elite fighting unit, and that made out of material often viewed as too heterogeneous, for the Legion currently regroups 136 different nationalities. This highlights the interesting role of the legionnaire, for on the one hand, he epitomizes the figure of the warrior. He presents perhaps an exaggerated version of the stereotypes we associate with the soldier. Yet on the other hand, he disturbs and disrupts received ideas about soldierly motivations and the creation of a cohesive fighting force. At its outset, the Legion was conceived of as for the nation, but not of the nation, at once acting in the name of the nation, yet excluded from it, both incorporated yet held at a distance. The Legion could serve a useful purpose for France. The Legion maintained, perhaps until its relocation to Aubagne in mainland France at the end of the Algerian War, it maintained this distance from the nation through its far-flung postings and the curious relationship with the nation of belonging yet not belonging. The Legion recruitment poster, the far one there, visually synthesizes the paradox of belonging and not belonging, because it displays three coterminous layers of identity. The képi blanc, the white hat, the white képi, signaling immediately the primary belonging to the Legion. The foregrounding of the tricolour, symbolizing the Legion's ralliement to the French nation, and that simultaneous distancing of the Legion evoked here through an identification of the spatial homeland of Algeria through the use of the relief of the Atlas Mountains. The legionnaire occupies a liminal space. He doesn't belong to the country he has left, although the promise of French citizenship is held out to him under the tradition of bloodshed in the name of the nation. It cannot be obtained until the end of his tour of duty, however. He doesn't normally serve on French territory, and the Legion HQ wasn't normally on French soil. Hence the Legion motto, Legio Patria Nostra, the Legion is my homeland. Thus, although assimilated to the Legion and by inference to France, the Legionnaire doesn't belong to the nation until he has proved his worth and served his purpose. Whilst a Legionnaire, he remains deterritorialised. The Legion is his only homeland. Nonetheless, the Legion provides a model of how to create, sustain and promote a given identity and a set of values across time, space and differences of culture. It shows how a cultural heritage can successfully be forged and fostered amongst a diverse set of individuals. It's perhaps France's genius to have achieved this by creating once more something sacred of the secular. The rehabilitation of the Legion's image was perhaps most successfully achieved through the invention of tradition. In the aftermath of World War I, a decimated, unpopular and disunified Legion sought to ensure its survival. It fell to Général Paul Rollet, the father of the Legion, to create a distinct identity to bind together its disparate combatants, and which used as its foundations a shared history, binding myths, sacred places and objects. Rollet reached back into the Legion's past to resurrect, reaffirm and restructure symbols, practices and law which would provide visible links between the pre-World War I Legion and its post-1918 successor. This would bestow legitimacy on the Legion in the eyes of its recruits and give them a sense of continuity and communion with past generations. And this was to be achieved through the institution of a set of highly symbolic and repetitive rituals, which would act as a means of inculcating values and standards of behaviour in legionnaires by implying that these were the perpetuation of hallowed practices. Rollet's goal was to bequeath the Legion the stability of an unchanging and invariable tradition in a period of turbulence and change. Under Rollet, Legion life came to be regulated by ceremonies, ritualized, formalized, and constantly repeated. One ceremony came to occupy a central place in Legion tradition, Cameron. And I was fortunate enough last weekend to be invited to attend the British-French Foreign Legion Association's annual celebration of Cameron and to participate in the many rituals that bind together former legionnaires from very different backgrounds and very different generations. As you can see in the two photos, they meet at the statue of Maréchal Foch just outside Victoria every year. Cameron celebrates the anniversary of a heroic last-stand battle fought at a lonely farmhouse in a remote Mexican village in 1863. It provides a central symbol of regimental legitimation and a potent behavioural model, as well as occasion for celebration. The expression faire Cameron, to do Cameroon, has come to mean fighting until the bitter end in the face of an overwhelming enemy, and is intended to epitomise the Legion's approach to its military duties. The Legionnaire's Code of Honour, for instance, reads, "A mission once given to you becomes sacred to you. You will accomplish it to the end and at all costs. In combat, you will act without relish of your tasks or hatred. You will respect the vanquished enemy and will never abandon neither your wounded nor your dead, nor will you, under any circumstances, surrender your arms." Cameron established a cult of heroic death in battle, of sacrifice and redemption, which is inscribed at the heart of the Legion's identity. And the ritualized place of Cameron in the Legionnaire's consciousness instills both a sense of what is required in order to be part of the Legion and a sense of common heritage. My interest in the Legion, however, lies not only with its role in the Empire, its current post-colonial function, and the ways in which the Legionnaire simultaneously tends to confirm and overturn received ideas about soldiers and military units. What also interests me are the ways in which the Legionnaire functions as a sign, a paradigmatic sign at that, which translates across national and cultural borders through the intermediary of popular culture. And popular culture, it has to be said, shows absolutely no signs of becoming immune to the appeal of the Legion. An enormous variety of films from all periods feature the Legion. The Daily Star, the Bo Peep cartoon here, which has been running since 1975, but also Snoopy, Mickey Mouse, Biggles, Bugs Bunny, Captain Gallant, Tarzan, Laurel and Hardy, Abbott and Costello, etc., 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 have all served with the French Foreign Legion to create comic, moralistic, didactic, and often just plain silly tales of adventure and romance. As we've seen, at different times, the Legion has been perceived by onlookers as both an elite force and a loose ragbag of villains and ne'er-do-wells. A model of, on the one hand, of a disciplined fighting unit and the epitome of a rowdy, drunken, skirt-chasing rabble. These parallel images of the Legion exist throughout popular culture. On the one hand, the legionnaire is a lawless mercenary, epitomised by titles such as Devils, Not Men, and The Legion of the Damned. And this version of the legionnaire was a frequent feature of pulp fiction magazines aimed at male readers, such as All Star Fiction, Argosy, Man's Odyssey, and Adventure. And they often headlined Legion tales under lurid banners such as Fetish Fighters, Soldiers of Misfortune, and The Living Lose. And you can see some examples there. Other magazines, such as Stag and Top Notch, preferred to emphasise the abundant sexual adventures supposedly available to the legionnaire, with front covers which featured kepi-wearing saviours and swooning exotic beauties. The legionnaire has also frequently been portrayed as a romanticised hero. He's fatally attractive to women, yet remains the ultimate unattainable man. This version of the legionnaire hero was popularised by major hits from the interwar years, such as Piaf's Mon Légionnaire and Marie Dubas' Fagnon de la Légion. Although romanticised, this legionnaire has a key feature in common with his counterpart from men's magazines. He can never be domesticated. Studying the legionnaire foregrounds the ways in which images, ideas and meanings are transmitted across national borders and cultural boundaries. For while the legionnaire disseminates a certain idea of Frenchness across borders, it also serves as a useful vehicle for other nations' own mythologies. The Legion is flexible and malleable. It provides a multiplicity of readings and meanings which can be shaped and moulded to fit nation and history. Individuals, for instance, who are lost, found, saved, sacrificed, redeemed. Masculinities we despise, pity, seek to emulate. Heroism we view as noble, mercenary, futile, and an institutional location which is authoritarian, draconian, fraternal, paternal. If the Legion endlessly refashions its recruits, it is also endlessly refashioned itself. This consistent cultural output seems to signal that the Legion embodies some crucial characteristics which transcend cultural boundaries and national cultures. There's some essence, perhaps, epitomised by the image of the legionnaire, which is capable of transnational resonance. And the legionnaire is filtered through a variety of lenses to a variety of purposes. For instance, 1940s and 1950s Hollywood versions of the Legion are often minimally repackaged versions of America's own pioneer myths, whilst British versions of the Legion myths are often seen through the prism of empire. Many popular films use the legionnaire simply as shorthand for hero along the lines of the Western genre or the battle epic, whilst others explore the more multifaceted questions which the experience of a legionnaire can foreground. Legion narratives, and some suggest they're a subgenre in their own right, can provide insights into the Western uses of exoticism, the evolution of gender relationships, the construction of the other, a variety of masculinities, and, as we might expect, the individual's ontological wrestling with themes such as identity, sacrifice, belonging, fraternity, and patriotism. Newer incarnations of older stereotypes have also emerged. Serge Gainsbourg, for instance, recorded a version of Piaf's Mon Légionnaire in 1988, adding a pseudo-queer dimension to the primarily heterosexual image of the unattainable legionnaire. And I'm not going to let this opportunity go by without mentioning the female gaze, which is just an academic term, to be honest, which allows me to show all of these sorts of images and to curry favour with the female members of the audience. These images show, respectively, the work of, on this side, French filmmaker Claire Denis, and on the other, Italian photographer Giorgia Fiorio. And these are very aestheticised portrayals of the Legion. And more broadly, the aestheticisation of war and of military imagery has fed into a concern with what might be termed a pleasure culture of war. A pleasure culture of war as evidenced across a wide range of cultural forms, from the massive popularity of adventure war stories as best-selling fiction, comics, films and television series, to the use of war themes by the tourism and leisure industries, and by the military themselves in museums, open days, historic sites and spectaculars, as well as war play and games, from toy soldiers and modelling to nowadays computer games. And this feeds very much into a future project on war in the everyday, concerned with how past conflict has shaped our everyday life through language, landscape, childhood and even fashion. And whilst researching and collecting Legion recruitment posters and more recent filmic ads aimed at military recruitment, which again I hope will form the basis of a future collaborative research project, I stumbled into a large range of untapped sources which linked soldiering with empire. Because I discovered that some 30 posters, recruitment posters, either full-size billboard posters, postcards, and also some recruitment brochures, had been designed and disseminated during the interwar years in France, with a view to recruiting personnel to the European branch of its colonial army. This obviously links back to anxieties concerning the quality of colonial personnel that France had been exporting to the empire. And what underpinned my interest, there's just 3 examples here, was what role the poster played in this wider idea of the pleasure culture of war. And an analysis of the sedimented content of these tools of propaganda provides insights into the fantasies that exist about the attractions of combat, which in turn encourage men to volunteer in anticipation, perhaps, of being given the opportunity to emulate the heroes that they had seen and read about since infancy, and to take part in such stirring times as had been depicted. These posters also contain the types of recruitment hooks which are still discernible in many modern-day advertisements for the armed forces. They promise financial incentives, security, the possibility of travel, and adventure in all its forms. But what might these images have said to the young men at whom they were aimed? A phenomenological approach to visual imagery would place emphasis on the location of the posters and the body's experience of them. As part of the landscape of everyday France, clashing with their surroundings, the bright colours and exotic imagery would have provided a counterpart to the drab walls on industrial buildings, or created perhaps an anomalous feature in the middle of rural France. A small piece of a faraway land is transported to the mainland, and the instantaneity of the poster engages the observer in a mental journey. Certainly, the notions of European prestige and status are foregrounded. The troops depicted have an aristocratic, almost regal bearing, which could well have proved alluring to the poor metropolitan labourers of the 20s and 30s. For the posters immediately interpolate the viewer as dissatisfied with his lot. The images imply that the product can alleviate this state of dissatisfaction, as with adverts, and this is often achieved through the presentation of figures of glamour that consumers can envy and wish to emulate, people who are represented as already transformed through financial security and the acquisition of status. Secondly, the empire had long been figured as a place where adventures took place and men became heroes. And the primary forms of adventure held out here are travel and sex. The promise of travel is still a hallmark of military recruitment. At the height of empire, recruitment to the colonial meant that travel to exotic, far-off lands was no empty promise, and indeed many of the recruitment pamphlets read like tourist brochures and include brief travelogues describing the principal attractions of various parts of the French Empire. And terms of enlistment were and still are often referred to as tours of duty. The use of the word tour implies exactly that. Military duty is an opportunity to tour other countries. Tour also implies that one's presence in a foreign country will be benign, just like that of any other tourist. Stationed overseas, military personnel will be able to travel and partake of local cultures and curiosities, just like a tourist. Thirdly, one unstated and unofficial promise of this tourism is that of sexual adventure and sexual tourism. This is another long-standing trope attached to empire, established during the period of Enlightenment, from Diderot onwards and through to Baudelaire and beyond. In literature, popular song and fiction, these recruitment posters draw on a well-rehearsed and well-understood analogy, empire as sexual adventure. The slogan accompanying the first poster says, "The colonial troops invite you to travel with them." But in many ways, it may as well have read, "Indigenous women invite you over to the empire," with all its promise of half-naked beauties displaying their wares for metropolitan consumption. But the image is also important for its very clear positioning of the colonizer and the colonized, and the conferral on the recruit of a particular status which is implied. The standing and seated postures may well reflect cultural norms and differences, but the choice was made to depict these two soldiers before the seated woman and not haggling in the background on more even terms with the indigenous men at the back of the marketplace. And the stance of these two French soldiers suggests an ease and self-assurance. The khaki-clad figure wears a supercilious expression which is reinforced by the semi-aggressive gesture of hand on hip, and body language experts suggest that this is a gun-toting posture which in males also draws attention to the genitalia. So we're all going to be really self-conscious now. He's expressing his superiority in terms of strength, race, gender and sexuality, and his smiling compatriot, though less immediately threatening perhaps, holds out a hand as if the woman is for his taking. Armies today still use the promise of combined travel and sex in order to get recruits to sign on the dotted line, and this stereotype has been used in order to update another. Join the military, meet interesting people and kill them has become see the world, meet interesting people and have sex with them. So, post-conquest in these posters anyway, the fun side of empire came to the fore in military propaganda. Manly pursuits were still foregrounded, but it wasn't necessarily war that was foregrounded. And what is stripped from these images is any direct or overt correlation between soldiering and combat. War and the accoutrements of war are absent. There are no weapons, no machinery, no display of military technology. Military violence is largely absent from these images, but is perhaps replaced with the implicit violence of the colonial relationship and the threat of a form of sexual violence or aggression. Stripped of the brutalities and grotesqueness of military realities, this is a sanitized version of military life, almost like a leisure and lifestyle portrayal. These are the policemen, perhaps, of empire, rather than the soldiers of empire. This imbrication of war and colonialism has, however, a much more immediate resonance in contemporary France. The re-emergence, or redeployment perhaps, of colonial stereotypes, along with the resurgence of repressed, censored and silenced narratives of French conflict, have engendered the latest in France's series of wars, this time memory wars. And as the synopsis to this lecture stated, France has been central to major international conflicts of the 20th century and provides an exemplary objective research, as the nation is perhaps unique in having experienced in its recent history 2 world wars, 2 colonial wars and civil war. France has been both the victim but also the aggressive prosecutor of war. And these various experiences of conflict have come very much to the fore in public debate over recent years, and it is now the aftermaths of such conflicts which haunt the nation in the form of memory wars and debates. These public debates throw into relief the relations of power that structure the ways in which wars can be remembered across forms that range from public commemoration orchestrated by the nation state through to the personal testimonies of survivors, and from the cultural memories of war as articulated through cinema and fiction to juridical investigations of wartime atrocities in the courts. The debates throw light on the contestation of meaning that occurs within and between these various forms and practices, and highlight the unequal relationship between installing particular memories at the centre of a cultural world at the expense of others, which are then marginalised and forgotten. There has existed a conceptual, ideological and experiential divide between monolithic state history and memory on the one hand, and plural individual histories and memories on the other, which begs the question, who controls the narratives of nation and of war, and who controls how these narratives are relayed and told to others? A growing and disparate movement in France of what might broadly be termed memory activism has emerged over the past few years, which has sought more accurately to inscribe national memories of war and empire and the roles played therein by France's minorities. Well-established and widely accepted state narratives of war and national identity have come under pressure from without. Sorry, I'm just losing my voice a little bit, if you don't mind. Sorry. Widely accepted state narratives of war and national identity have come under pressure from without, as subaltern memories have challenged the monolithic nature of official history. Alongside the resurgence of suppressed narratives of past conflict in the media, in popular culture, and also in the courts, the nation has also been challenged to acknowledge its own, sometimes criminal activities during wartime. The term devoir de mémoire, duty of and to memory, has been invoked by veterans associations, the deported, persecuted minorities, civil victims of war, and the descendants of a wide variety of different wartime actors. Many of these groups specifically challenge what they view as a solely Eurocentric history of the last century's wars. Numerous commemorations, days of remembrance, monuments and official declarations of national gratitude have proliferated, and the French government has recognised memory as a site of national contention, and through an initiative entitled Mémoire partagée, shared memory, has sought to reinforce transnational links with the intention of encouraging the transmission of a combative past and recognition of veterans to younger generations. This period of hyper-memorialisation of past conflict does not, however, appear to have pacified contentious memories or brought about reconciliation. Rhetorical wars over hierarchies of victimhood have been waged, and battle lines from the past have tended to be redrawn. Former European settlers in Algeria, known as Pieds Noirs, have strongly lobbied for state recognition of their own suffering when they had to leave Algeria at the end of the War of Independence, but also for recognition of the positive benefits they perceive French colonialism to have wrought in Algeria. And both these satirical cartoons are related to the law of the 23rd of February 2005, which has since been abrogated after tremendous public debate, because the law was intended to place on the French school curriculum lessons concerning the recognition of the pioneering and positive role of France overseas in its empire. So in the first you have someone laying a flower at a statue to the good colonizer, and in the second you have a schoolgirl asking her teacher, if our presence was so beneficial, why did they make us leave? Meanwhile, activist groups such as Nous sommes les indigènes de la République, which literally translates as we are the natives of the Republic, have strongly countered this perceived revisionism with rallying cries which accuse France of remaining a colonial state and pinpoint the persistence of colonial practices and in particular the colonial management of France's predominantly ethnic inner cities. When civil unrest led to rioting in the streets in 2005, many commentators indeed resorted to language reminiscent of the period of colonial conquest in describing rioters as little savages fighting a jihad on European soil. And this identity card here, which is, I don't know whether you can read it very well, it's an identity card for blacks, Arabs, Muslims, the stigmatized and the diabolized, and it makes reference to the riots explicitly. It's crossed through to signify a denial of identity to those people and is stamped with the word racaille, scum, which refers to Sarkozy, Nicolas Sarkozy's designation of those who were living in the banlieue in these areas at the time. And this movement, Les Indigènes de la République, brings to the fore issues of ancestral memory, or what has been termed post-memory, because post-memory signals the shift from a narrative based on direct memory, i.e. first-hand witnesses of something that's happened, and shifts instead to cultural productions which explore what it means to live under the shadow of past wars or past oppression. Post-memory means constantly negotiating events and experiences which lie outside direct personal experience, but which nevertheless shape the subjectivities of those people who are outside that memory in very profound ways. And analysis of these memory wars provides telling insights into the ways in which conflictual memories of war force a continued negotiation and renegotiation and indeed reappraisal of the past. One example of this trend towards memory activism on the part of one's ancestors is Rachid Bouchareb's 2006 film Indigènes. It's a film about the role of colonized North African soldiers in World War II. It's not frequent that a cultural product forces policy change, but this is the case with this film. The film provided a catalyst for a crucial thaw in France's attitude towards its indigenous veterans, because laws of the 50s, 70s and 80s had frozen indigenous veterans' pensions at 1/3 of that of their metropolitan counterparts. But after years of campaigning and petitioning, those veterans were seemingly no nearer to gaining recognition for the role that they had played in the liberation of France. On the release of Bouchareb's film, however, the French Minister for Veterans Affairs announced that the French government had agreed to an unfreezing of veterans' pay. And the new measures had a bearing on 75,000 veterans' pensions and affected former colonial troops from 20 different countries. And finally, it was conceded that these formerly colonized veterans should be considered as French, French by virtue of the values they defended, and French by virtue of bloodshed. Now, incidentally, Bouchareb published as a 4-page advertisement in the Guardian newspaper on the release of his film a letter addressed to Tony Blair, urging him to reassess the situation of the Gurkhas. But clearly, sadly, for us, nothing much happened, and unfortunately now we have to suffer those dreadful headlines throughout the media about how absolutely fabulous Joanna Lumley is. Anyway, despite being hailed as not Joanna Lumley, despite being hailed as a post-colonial triumph, the film poses dilemmas for the critic, or for this critic anyway, because the film does little to disabuse the casual spectator of a view in which France's colonised subjects were the nation's greatest apologists and the strongest proponents of an idealised vision of French glory. What emerges most strongly from the portrayal of 4 very different characters and their varying motivations is an unchallenged belief in the values of the French Republic and the civilising values of the French Empire. The national motto of liberté, égalité, fraternité still serves as a rallying cry to the most dissident of the cohort. The tricolour is prominently and frequently used as a symbol of the seemingly unquestionable assimilation of native aspirations to the universal French model, the ideals of an idealised French Republic remains sacrosanct. Part of the problem with this film also lies with the fact that the film follows traditional narrative and cinematic formulae and tends towards a relatively comfortable portrayal of soldierly motivations, much like the Hollywood-style war epics to which it clearly aspires. And it's somewhat disappointing that a portrayal of these relatively unacknowledged aspects of World War II relies so entirely on well-worn and conventional cinematic conventions and tropes. It's as if the colonial and ethnic dimension of participation in this war has been superposed upon existing and largely Americanized versions of World War II, i.e. a just war fought by the greatest generation, with no concomitant attention given to the ways in which cinematic form might have been altered by the foregrounding of different and alternative narratives of that war. And from at least 3/4 of the way through, the film reads as a sort of Gallicized and ethnicized version of Saving Private Ryan, a sort of maybe slaying ethnic Ryan, perhaps. With its, because it has this intimate focus on close quarters battle against a seemingly overwhelming enemy. And similarly, the film draws to its close with a scene in which the protagonist returns to the graves of his fallen comrades 60 years after World War II, exactly like Saving Private Ryan does. In Indigène, or Days of Glory, as the Americans renamed it, in that film, Abdelkader, this protagonist, goes back to his foyer, a bare and lonely single room in a housing block intended for migrant workers, representing essentially the fate of the male Maghrebi migrant worker in post-boom France. But the narrative leap at the end of Boucharab's film, so from the end of World War II to contemporary France, effectively draws a veil over the intervening period, and most crucially draws a veil over the crucial incidents of the Franco-Algerian War. For in France, the figure of the colonial veteran disturbs and entangles discourses from earlier periods with those of the present. Allies and enemies shift, revolve and change garb. In the case of France and Algeria, the colonial veteran problematizes the relationship of one war with another and demonstrates the retroactive impact of a more recent war on our views of its predecessors. For the actors in the Franco-Algerian War were very often the same actors in World War II, their roles, however, reconfigured in a bloody parody of the perceived loyalty and union of the latter. And finally, to bring this lecture to a close, I'm going to go back full circle to the beginning, or back, in any rate, to colonial, or perhaps here, semi-colonial identities, ideologies and discourses, to something which is still fairly embryonic research into the French concession in Tianjin, China, which is the subject of an ESRC project with former colleagues from Bristol. The Treaty of Beijing in 1860 was signed by a defeated Qing government at the close of the Second Opium War in 1860. Sorry, I've just said 1860. Yeah. One of its provisions made Tianjin a treaty port, and in the 90 years that followed, the city was transformed. By 1947, Tianjin became the second largest city in China with a population of 1.7 million. A small but significant minority of those residents were foreigners, ensconced in one of the 9 concessions that the foreign powers demanded and then built in Tianjin between 1860 and 1902. But I'm going back also to the correlation between war and empire, for the disciplinary practices exerted through the city are revealing of imperatives but also of anxieties relating to the maintenance of colonial hierarchy and status. The city, on the one hand, is a pure expression of colonial authority. On the other, it's also a fragile rampart against internal and external threat. So this research takes as one of its premises the hypothesis of French urbanist and thinker Paul Virilio that the city, or here perhaps the city within the city, exists as a result of war and functions as a preparation for war. So, finally, despite the initial title of this lecture, you'll probably see that I have fairly infrequently held the line. My interests lie in the interstices between disciplines and in the resonances, synergies, and mutual and multiple cross-fertilizations which can and should occur across disciplines. Whether or not the latest jargon of the academy means that interdisciplinarity has truly been thrown over in favour of post-disciplinarity, I, for one, would hope that universities, and indeed the bodies which formally assess universities' research, remain flexible enough to contain and nurture academics whose interests range beyond the often rather narrow confines of traditionally designated disciplines. So, in conclusion, I hereby profess to continue not to hold the line.
I'm John Stone, head of the School of Humanities. It's my pleasure to move the vote. Thanks. I just want to say a couple of very brief things before I do that. Swansea University has been home over the years to a very long series of distinguished scholars of the language, literature, culture and history of France and of the Francophone world. We heard at the beginning of the lecture from the Vice-Chancellor of Mary Williams. We should also mention Michael Cardy, Valerie Minogue, Alan Davis, Julian Jackson, and of course many, Mr. Harness, equally distinguished scholars. And as we heard from tonight's lecture, Professor Cooper is building on and extending that tradition of scholarship into the French world, and she's doing it in exciting and, I think, indisputably interdisciplinary, not post-disciplinary ways. She's extended the critical gaze, as we heard tonight, or saw tonight, into photography, film, recruitment posters and visual propaganda. She's explored the reality and the fantasy of colonialism from Tianjin to Madagascar and Dahomey. And she's related it all to the memory wars that are still being fought in French culture, newspapers, society today. She's shown us, I think, the way that the empire became embodied in both maternal figures and the swaggering French foreign legionnaire. The taste she's given tonight of the book she's writing or completing on the French Foreign Legion has certainly whetted my appetite. She's argued, I think, very persuasively tonight that the Legion, with its image of barely contained criminality and its indisputable romantic, even sexual allure, forms a strange but obviously important intermediary between the colonizer and the colonized. In a series of striking paradoxes, the Legion for France but not of France, warriors but not often portrayed with the tools of the kit and their kit in action, an empire built on enlightenment and civilization, but also on the reality of detritus, decadence and delinquency. The pleasure, as she brought out, that we still take in warfare, the way we consume it. All these paradoxes have been very striking in her talk. She's illuminated, therefore, not just French colonial history tonight, but the vitality of cultural history. So can I ask you to join me in congratulating Professor Cooper once again on a splendid inaugural lecture.